Thank you, Christina. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional territories of the Ohlone people in California. And I want to offer thanks to the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Regina. It's got a great open education and publishing initiative underway. And in particular, I want to thank Shauna Neeson, who has been a great support in setting up this talk and organizing all of this. I want to invite you to consider going outside. I want to suggest to you that you might want to put on your headphones, switch this broadcast or webinar to a phone and go for a walk, take a hike, because I'm not going to use slides. I've decided that I've enjoyed so many podcasts outdoors that I thought maybe I could help you do the same. So I am going to cover quite a bit of territory, but you might as well. So do give it some consideration. And if you miss a little bit in the transition, that's okay. I tend to repeat myself. So the talk for today is called What Are the Paths to Sustainable and Universal Open Access? I want to consider those paths in terms of my own 28 or so year history in this project, of the Public Knowledge Project. And I want to consider it in terms of 26 years. Let me just get my math straight here. I want to consider it in terms of different strategies that we've tried, different techniques, but always with this one goal. Okay? So, in a sense, if you take nothing else from this talk, take this notion that we should be expecting, we deserve, and we need sustainable and universal open access. Okay? Open access, in a sense, we've made great progress with, as I'll review, but sustainable and universal open access still eludes us. So I'm hoping that this will become an expectation, sustainable and universal open access. I'm hoping it'll become a mantra. Just keep repeating it to yourself as you take each step. And I'm hoping that it'll be a measure for us to use to evaluate new proposals, developments, steps forward in terms of whether it takes us closer to sustainable and universal open access. The time frame for reaching that point, well, I'm going to review a bit of history here so you'll get a sense it's not going to be overnight. I'm taking the position that let's start with where we are today. So I would say it's fair, but not accurate, and we don't have a precise notion of what degree of the literature today is open access. I think 50%, halfway there, is reasonable, certainly for recent research. But if you take the whole body of research, it's certainly going to be less than that. And we have been taking incremental steps in reaching that 50% over what I would say is roughly the last 2.5 decades. And the last 50% is going to be very challenging. So I want to consider that because the last 50% will bring us to universal open access. And I want to consider whether that'll be sustainable or not. As we currently stand, it's not the case, sustainable or universal. Where we currently stand, open access is dominated in terms of headlines and people's attention by article processing charges, APCs, by transformative agreements that are complicated ways of continuing the publishers to continue banking on subscriptions while offering some forms of open access publishing to those who sign the agreement and are paying for that open access. So we don't yet have a path, but the most promising development of the last few years has been the recognition of diamond open access, which I will get to. So we have this a kind of whirlwind of forces at work. We have a way in which it is the best and not the worst of times, but it's the best and not so good times, especially in terms of the pricing or the sustainability of open access. I want to address all of that, and I need to do that. I don't need to, but I want to do it in a historical fashion. I want to give you a sense of where we've come. Some of these things you'll have to check with your parents and grandparents, the younger members of my audience. But I'm a pretty reliable witness for the last 3 or so decades, certainly. The 1990s, this all is rooted in the 90s with the introduction of the internet. There was huge excitement at that time, great expectations of the promise of the internet to deliver knowledge worldwide. to deliver knowledge in every classroom, in every home, and every public library, certainly. And that utopian excitement gave rise to a number of projects during that 1990s and the first few years of the 21st century, not least among them, Wikipedia. Just an outstanding example, one that I thought was impossible when it first began as an educator. But we have all been great beneficiaries of it. The Internet Archive, it's a center of controversy occasionally, but still a very promising project. Project Gutenberg, with all of the major texts available, made freely available. Open source software, which is going to be key, was born out of the 1990s, although goes back earlier into the free software movement. And finally, PKP, the Public Knowledge Project. We came in at the end as a conception, 1998. We formed before the path was clear for where scholarship was going in terms of the internet. You may have forgotten this. It seems like such a long time ago, but in the end of the 90s, the question about research wasn't open. The question about research was, should it be going online? And for many people, I have to say, it wasn't even a question, because research will not be going online, because that would devalue it. That would make it less trustworthy if it was online. And so that was the starting point for PKP. The Public Knowledge Project began with the notion that we should be taking, as scholars, as researchers, as librarians and students, we should be taking advantage of this new digital era to see how we can extend access to research. I had been a school teacher for a decade. I had been a fan of research, and at the time, it was difficult to get your hands on it. And I had to end up doing, as many people do, taking courses at a college and having access to the library. But it was not anything like what we thought the promise of the internet might hold for us. So that initial project really wasn't open access so much as getting journals to move online and then begin to share their work. And it was a project that I thought we needed to find a way of helping people to move online. I started the project just by exhorting people to move your journals online and make them free. And I pounded the table and I said, it's obvious. We're educators. We want to share what we know. It's good for our research. It was not working. I needed something more. I needed to help people make that transition from print to digital, because digital was the only form. I mean, I wasn't going to hand out journals on buses. Digital was the only form in which it could begin to become much more, perhaps even universally and sustainably open access. And that was the beginning of the project. And one of the ways I realized that I could help editors and publishers begin to move online was to give them a platform, was to give them a technical means of moving online. And for me, that was the beginning. I had to make it in a way that would be sustainable and that it would be universal for anyone to use. And that's where my project began to realize that the open source software movement was a natural ally or partner. And so I wanted to tap into that open source software initiative, excuse me. And I had the help of undergraduate students at University of British Columbia at the time. This is now in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002. And I realized that open source software was strangely, it's been called an impossible public good, because people contribute code that helps people run their businesses on open source software, that helps them deliver goods on open source software, that helps them devise new approaches to sharing knowledge in this case. And that seemed to me the perfect way. It would be sustainable because a community was developing, even in the early 2000s, around open source software. There had to be that commitment, and there was, to sustaining it. And so we decided to build a platform, a publishing platform that would make it easier for publishers and editors and journal managers to move online. And we decided to do it on the basis of existing interesting twist on this is because I was an author, I was a researcher submitting articles and systems. And you published it. But in fact, it was a review or submission manager, editorial manager, publishing platform. True story. We decided to design a complete system as I'd experienced it. Um, and the system that we designed to move journals online in 2002, OJS was released for the first time. And I have to tell you, it was free, but it wasn't an easy sell. In 2002 were still reluctant to move online. I had to convince them that it was sustainable. I had to convince them that it could be used universally in any topic, subject area, in any place in the world. And in order to do that, I ended up, I have to admit, being something of a salesperson, something of a uh, let me explain to you. I did this for a number of years and ended up describing it, OJS that is, as cheaper than free. Okay, that's sustainable. How could it be cheaper than free? Well, if you move your journal online, you don't need stationery anymore. You don't need an editorial office. You could save money by moving it online, which made our software cheaper than it was already free, cheaper than free. We had to make it easier than email, sending an email. So we would automatically populate your invitation for a reviewer with the text of the review, the abstract of the article, an invitation, and automatically populate the email address into the browser. And so it was easier than sending email because it was all prepared for you. You could dress it up. And then finally, we sold it on this universality notion of greater readership, that you would have a readership unlike anything you had ever had in print. And underneath all of that was the open access message that, in fact, if I gave you this free software, this publishing platform for you to use wherever you wish to use it, then surely you would want to repay that effort, that gift, by making your research that you published open access. Again, a little bit of naivete goes a long way, well, slowly, because of course that didn't always happen. And OJS began in a very modest way with the first 10 journals took a long time. The first 100 journals took years, or at least a year or so. So it was a slow, slow process. But I have other lessons to share with you, and we'll see how that develops as we go in terms of the growth of OJS. That's 2002, the release of OJS. In 2004, I received an email from Google Scholar, from Anurag Achura, who is the chief engineer of Google Scholar. And was kind of surprised, but he was interested in indexing the journals that we're using. That weren't many, hundreds, but very few, relatively few compared to others. Journals that were using OJS, and it was a really important point for us. The first response was, "It's Google, and maybe we're not comfortable working with this big already." By 2004, a fairly large commercial entity. There was no advertising involved in the Google Scholar Index. It seemed good to us, but it seemed like a compromise. And it was an important lesson to us because Google Scholar gave us that universal aspect we couldn't provide. It gave us a way of indexing, a way of being discovered, a way for the research that was being published to be discovered. It integrated those who used OJS into the larger world of research. And for me, that became a very important principle, the universality. How can we promote the universality of those who are using our sustainable publishing platform? So we compromised in a sense, but we tried to adhere. Google Scholar was slow forming its standards for indexing and those sorts of things. I won't get you into the details. But I will jump ahead for a moment here in terms of the time, because the indexing has remained for us an extremely important aspect. because as OJS has grown into the world's largest, most widely used at least, um, publishing platform, we have a responsibility to ensure that indexing. And while Google Scholar is in the area of 89% of our journals are indexed in Google Scholar, it's not true of the other indexes. And those other indexes are widely used. And so that remains a challenge for us. So to jump ahead from 2004 to 2024, just for a moment, I'm going to go back. The indexing question is also one that we're addressing through nonprofit open source indexes like OpenAlex. And here we're taking a very different approach. We're collaborating with OpenAlex to improve their indexing of OJS because we see that a non-commercial alternative, if you like, is something that would be very important for developing. And the fact about OpenAlex is also it's more open to research, more open to investigations from learning more about scholarly communication across this wide distribution of different models. And in particular, and given the growth and development of the Diamond open access model, which I will get to in a few moments. So that indexing aspect is not always considered when we talk about universal open access. That seems to mean just everything is open. But everything being open is not necessary. Let's be clear. Everything open is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It has to be integrated into the larger body of research, and it has to be discoverable so that it can be fully utilized in all instances. 2000, so it was 2004 when Google Scholar first reached out to us. We continued to work with them. We just recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've improved their coverage of languages. We discovered about 3 years ago that there were 60 languages that were being used to publish research. OJS is available in about 30, it's not all complete, but in the area of 30 to 35 languages, but people are using it to publish in multilingual journals to publish in the area of 60 languages. Um, and that for us is an important aspect in terms of our work with Google Scholar because we were able to improve their coverage of multiple languages. They learned, actually, it was both ways. They helped us in terms of our coding around capturing the languages, and they took a lesson in terms of the research that they needed to be sensitive to in languages other than English. English is the dominant language used with OJS, it's true, but multilingual journals constitute almost half the journals. So it's by no means the kind of pervasive notion that English is the language of science. No, that's not the case. It's a much more diverse world out there. So in 2005, though, that's a year later, we formed a partnership. I formed a partnership with Simon Fraser University, in particular, Simon Fraser University Libraries. And this was a key lesson about sustainability for me. I realized at that point that it was important to stay within my community, the academic community and the library community. That is the group most interested, strongest advocates of access to knowledge at that time. And Simon Fraser reached out to us, to me, and to the project and those who were involved in it, to give us more than just a kind of acknowledgement or endorsement. They provided something that was valuable and needs to be understood in terms of what is sustainable and what is universal. And that is administrative support. That is an understanding of how the institution works. That is a way in which we could manage that sustainability on a long-term basis. Because part of that sustainability is the long term. The longer than any one professor's career, longer than any one group of people, project, lab, it has to have that vision of what is to be sustained and what is going to last. And Simon Fraser University Libraries recognized that, and I saw that in them. That we were close to those that we were going to serve in our affiliation. And it has served us extremely well and continues to into today. In 2000, so that was 2005, 2012, it seems like another high point or a highlight, sorry, another highlight in terms of thinking about the universality aspect. I've just dealt with the sustainability around the library. Universal aspect for me became apparent in around 2010, leading to the release in 2012 of Open Monograph Press, a perfect complement to OJS, Open Journal Systems, but devoted to books. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, journals had moved online. You know, it was kind of, it just happened over that period of a decade, but it finally happened and it was complete virtually. And books were still in print, and the attention and the financing going to books was being reduced. It raised interesting questions for me because I was a scholar in the area of the humanities and social sciences. Books were very important to me. And here I was perhaps contributing by supporting open journals, open access journals, and journals online, that I was contributing to the decline of that place. And it's really the unit of scholarship that the book represents that I think is so important. It's why I write books, to get have the advantage of having that larger unit of scholarship, or the size of thought, if you like. So we decided we could build and take lessons from OJS and build a comparable version of for monographs and edited volumes, Open Monograph Press. Now, it has nowhere near had the impact. It's not the largest, most widely used system in the world for books, as is the case for OJS, but it has made a difference. And we are just revitalizing it at this point, a decade and a few years since we first launched it, with the idea that there is still a need to support open access to books. And that movement for open access to books, which was nowhere in 2010 when we started, is now substantial. There are a number of organizations devoted, and a number of publishers are using this. In my own books that we just mentioned, the Copyright's Broken Promise is available freely in print, if you like, with a nice cover, but it's also available free as a PDF, and we'll be sharing a link to that in a few moments, perhaps. So that's 2017, just to move ahead again. I'm going back to the sustainable part. Okay, we're going to kind of reciprocate between what is sustainable and what is universal. And the universality required that books also be included in our efforts to create open access, universal in the sense of all forms of scholarship. Financially or economically, or in terms of sustainability, in this period around the middle of the second decade, around 2015 to 2017, there was a realization. It's kind of obvious now, but at the time it was sort of a breakthrough. And that is, the libraries are spending enough money to make all of the research that's currently being published open access. Because open access does not cost anymore. It just takes a sense of sharing the work. And by that point, it was also pretty obvious that libraries were not gaining any advantage from having exclusive access to research. At my institution at Stanford, no one, which has a great library, but no one is enrolled at Stanford exclusively because, or sorry, no one is enrolled at Stanford because the library offers them exclusive access to all of its subscriptions, all of its subscribed material. There's something else at stake. The library and university do not gain by that exclusivity. It's not like a bicycle, where if you're not exclusive about your bicycle, it won't be there when you need it. But research in the digital era, it's nothing. It can be in your desk and everyone else's desk in the entire province, country. And there's no loss in terms of that. So we use that model that libraries had an interest in open access because their role, especially the University of Regina, a very strong Canadian university, provincial, supported, would be interested in sharing its research with the larger community, those who can't make it to campus, those who don't want to pay for parking, perhaps. And so that idea that we could find a way for the libraries to support open access turned into a model called Subscribe to Open. We would ask the libraries to pay what they paid for a normal closed subscription, only the journal would be open to everyone. Authors could submit without facing an article processing charge. Readers anywhere in the world could read the material. And it was tried out with some trepidation. We started talking about it, as I say, in 2017. By 2020, journals started to try it. Annual reviews, Berghahn Books were two of the good examples to begin with. Annual reviews, a nonprofit publishing one review a year in each of 40 or so subject areas. And Berghahn Books, very strong in the social sciences, commercial, but still interested in open access. And in both cases, they discovered a few things. That's in the year 2000 when they first ran this. One is the libraries were willing to pay the publisher for open access without a fear, in terms of raising a fear about free riding, in terms of canceling their subscription because they might be able to get it for free. Now, there was a reserve clause that said if we didn't have enough subscribers, if Annual Reviews or Berghahn Books didn't have enough subscribers to the journals, then they would keep it closed. But they didn't need, to invoke that. A subscribe to open worked. And in 2024, it's working with about 30 publishers, 200 journals. And those numbers, the number of publishers is going to double next year. And so the number of journals will grow even at an even greater pace. So that model of having the libraries collectively fund, having that support for open access more broadly based. And I want to point out that it is societies that are using this, a number of them in biology and forms of ecology. It is a non-commercial or nonprofit publishers like Annual Reviews and others, but it's also now, for the first time, beginning to affect the big players, Sage and De Gruyter. So instead of Sage and De Gruyter, which normally would depend on article processing charges for open access, they're beginning to explore, and again, it's through trials, but they've been successful so far, to support open access through the funding of the libraries. And what's interesting about it is it means for the library no increased expense. It's the same as the subscription. And what it means for the journal is the same revenue because they have subscription, equivalent of the subscription revenue. And so that model then seemed an easy path. In fact, even the subscription agents like EBSCO and others, and De Gruyter actually is working in this area now too as a subscription agency, their role is the same. They're just selling subscribe to open. The one limitation of this in terms of sustainability is it has no price checks. That if the journal normally has a very high subscription price, that price continues and it can be increased at the will of the publisher. So, and this is partly effective for attracting big publishers like De Gruyter in particular, but it's also a concern for the sustainability. And I want to, in a sense, I want to talk about a model that builds on subscribe to open, more than a model, a very different tact that builds on subscribe to open, but addresses this question of price. And the importance of this price, I think I need to be clear about, is that publishers essentially have a monopoly pricing situation. There is no substitute for nature, for science, for any journal. Though that journal has a distinct set of articles. And it's not like you're buying the equivalent of a different toothpaste. So they have a monopoly situation. Now, there are limits within that monopoly, but they have led to what's been called a serials crisis for the libraries. That is, their price increases have consistently exceeded inflationary rates. And so they have gained, as it were, more money from the libraries, and that has reduced the money that goes into research, because that money, I don't want to get into the details of that, but they are connected. And so this idea of monopoly pricing has been hurting research, has been hurting in access to knowledge because subscriptions have to be canceled due to the increase in pricing. So this led me to consider another form, another approach, something a little more radical than subscribe to open. Subscribe to open had that wonderful beauty of not disturbing, hardly disturbing the surface. Libraries paid what they paid before, publishers got what they had before. Only difference was it was all open. That was terrific. It's a little slow, we're at 200 journals. I think we'll double that and maybe triple it over the next few years. But we're talking about a world of 60, 80, maybe 100,000 journals. So we need something a little more quick. uh, and a little more universal in terms of who participates and sustainable. And so this got me thinking about copyright. What's interesting about copyright, and again, I had copyright is we have the Creative Commons license, so copyright hadn't been an issue for me. The Creative Commons license is used in open access all the time. CC BY in particular is the licensing, and that allows the author to retain the attribution or credit, but to share their work universally. And it certainly has increased to a greater circulation of research by all means, but it hasn't addressed the pricing that libraries are paying or that article processing charges are being paid by researchers. It hasn't addressed that aspect. And when it comes to copyright in the 21st century, in the digital era, um, you would think, or perhaps you're not aware, but there has been a great deal of change, of reform of copyright. There have been about 60 changes since the internet was first introduced, which goes back to 1989, 1990 or so. 60 changes to the law, but nothing for scholarship. My phone has had changes affecting it. The video streaming that you watched last night has had changes to the law to protect it. I'm going to talk about music in a moment, but there are a whole range of different forms that have changed. Gaming, video gaming has been had the law changed multiple times, copyright law, to protect the industry, but no concern for research and no change of research. And that struck me as kind of odd because research has radically changed in terms of its distribution model. Open access is taking hold, and even, I mean, I started this project on copyright in about 2020, 2021. Um, it had already had a huge impact, but the law had not changed. In fact, the last significant law in the United States, the last significant law change, sorry, copyright, was in 1976 when it became legal to make a photocopy of a research article that was in a library. And that's just not adequate today in terms of access to research. So I thought we need to make a change. What should that change be? Scholarship has been overlooked in terms of research. What could we do to bring it into the 21st century to address these issues of sustainable and universal open access? How and what form could that take? And there were a couple initiatives underway. I'm not the first to think about these things. And one of them was secondary publishing rights, which had actually been passed by a few countries, actually almost half a dozen countries in Europe. Secondary publishing rights reserved the right for authors, if the research was federally funded, and there was an embargo period for the publisher, the author could then make their final draft publicly available. Okay? Now, you'll notice that's very partial. That's only federally funded research, which is a fraction, not certainly less than half of the research. The final draft is really not totally adequate. Certainly in the humanities, it's unacceptable, but even in the sciences, the final draft does include peer review, by the way, but not the final version of record. Um, and so there was no price check. And so that initiative seemed to fall short for me. There was another initiative to strengthen exceptions like fair dealing in Canada and fair use in the US. But again, it treated research as an exception. And I feel strongly that research is not an exception to copyright. It's in fact one of the reasons. In the United States, the Constitution talks about the purpose of copyright to promote the progress of science. And I totally believe that. So we need a copyright law that's not an exception, that places research and gives it an importance. And so when I looked into it, I was kind of surprised to discover that research isn't even a category of work under copyright. It's like a form of literature, which is a great compliment, I suppose. But I mean, choreography has its own category, architectural drawings have its own category, and even a musical theater has its own category, and pantomime has its own category. That one really kind of got me. It was a mistake, a translation from French, but still the idea that pantomime is protected under copyright in a way that research isn't, that, I don't want to take anything from Marcel Marceau, believe me. but that seemed wrong to me. So my inspiration for really proposing something that would be universally sustainable and sustainably universal was, of course, who is the great champion of copyright in the music industry, Taylor Swift. Here was a chance for leadership that she exercised and that I could follow her model. In 2014, Taylor excuse me, takes her music off Spotify because Spotify is not covered by copyright law in the United States. Streaming services, that is, are not covered. And in 2014, and in 2018, 4 years later, that's all, the US government, Congress changed the law. The Music Modernization Act of 2018 was a radical change that brought streaming, like Spotify and Apple Music, into copyright. But what stunned me, not only the short period of time for her to have that kind of impact, and it wasn't just her, it was the whole industry agreed to this, was that I learned that Taylor doesn't get to set the price. There is a price control in music there's not in scholarship. In fact, since 1909, the music industry has been governed by copyright judges. Actually, that came later. It was originally governed by the law, stipulated how much that publishers of music could be paid. But eventually it was handed over to copyright judges who heard from the publishers and the composers and the musicians and the performers and the sales, the record stores and everyone, the public as it were, and set the price. And that really interested me. It's called statutory licensing or compulsory licensing. Statutory licensing seemed like something we needed. Because the other thing about Taylor Swift that I learned, and that's true for all musicians, but Taylor kind of holds my attention in this regard, is that it's universal. She cannot, no matter how, and I'm in a band, I have played music quite badly and quite well, but Taylor cannot stop. If I pay the license fee, the access to her music is universal. And that too seemed to me ideal. That the copyright judges ensure a sustainable, fair market price, and that price, once set, is universal. Now, you might wonder who's going to pay, because the fans, the Swifties, are very willing to pay, but in research, we don't want that kind of model. Those who can pay, and those who can't don't get access? No, 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 no. So we go back to subscribe to open. The libraries are already paying, and the funders are already paying, and nothing needs to change for them. They are paying for research because it is part of their function, part of their work to judge whether it's research or not, part of their work to collect it and make it available to all researchers in their community, on their campus, or in their larger community when it's open access. So that idea to me seemed just right for research. We needed something that applied universally. And so the compulsory or the statutory, I prefer statutory, the statutory licensing clause, if you like, for copyright reform that I envision is that we create a category for research alphabetically after pantomime. We create a category for research, and that category has a special statutory license applied to it. That statutory license says, in effect, that the publishers will make all of the research they publish openly available to be supported at a fair market price by the libraries and funders. And what is a fair market price? That's what the Copyright Board in Canada and the copyright judges in the United States and the Copyright Board in the UK and all these different jurisdictions will decide. And it will be argued every 5 years, and the fairness of it will go back and forth. But the other thing, the universality of it, is that in fact, Taylor Swift's music is being heard in restaurants. I think many of us have had this experience in many different parts of the world because there is an international agreement around copyright. Because copyright laws that are started in one country spread. We have an organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, part of the UN. We have trade agreements that ensure that copyright regulations are respected around the world. And so this, for me, seems a very Uh, it's certainly a lot. It's a very big ask to change copyright law. It's not to be treated lightly, but it is one that seems to hold promise for the universality and the sustainability of open access. My experience in terms of presenting this to people, I have to be honest with you, I was not universally embraced on this concept of sustainable, or let's use the concept of statutory licensing for sustainable and universal open access. One of the concerns, and I think it's a fair one for the librarians to raise, is there is a legacy of distrust of the publishers. They took advantage of their monopoly pricing in a way that has fostered this distrust. And we need to find a way to get over that. We need to, as it were, come to the table because there is a consensus now about the value of open access. There is an understanding after that pandemic, horrific pandemic, that open access saved lives, reduced the period in which we experienced those horrific conditions. And so this idea that we can begin to find a common ground as we have with open access. In fact, one of the kind of iron laws of copyright reform or change is you need a consensus to start. But we have a legacy of distrust, I'm afraid we need to overcome. But let me leave it at that as one prospect, one path among all the paths I've discussed so far, one path to universal and sustainable open access. Another very promising area, and this is more in the last couple of years, is the diamond open access, a recognition that there are many journals. In fact, we think it's about 80% or more of the journals using OJS. And just to be clear, open journal systems in 2022 was being used by 45,000, somewhat more, 44 to 45,000 active journals. And these journals are largely, in the vast majority, diamond. That is, they charge no author fees, no APCs, no author fees, and no reader fees. And they are supported by the institutions in which they exist. They're supported by the academic departments. They're supported by their libraries, and they're supported by the efforts of researchers and scholars to make them operate. So Diamond has become recognized, although it's been in existence since the beginning, the turn of the century, has become recognized as a viable model for going forward. But what I want to present to you, and just as a kind of concluding aspect for the current state of things, that recognition still requires a sense of how that sustainability will take us into the future and how will it become universal in terms of that integration that I raised earlier, in terms of the indexing and discoverability, in terms of the trust. Because we've gone in the course of this 21st century, we've gone from estimates of 30,000 journals as the whole of the research field, and I don't think that was entirely accurate, but it was a common figure, to notions that we're at more than twice, maybe three times that number of journals. So how does one navigate and how does one establish that the standards are being adhered to? And so the current project we're working with right now is the publication facts label. Think about your peanut butter jar, the back of the peanut butter jar, the back of whatever it is you're eating. There'll be a label that tells you about the sodium and the protein and other aspects, calories. And we want to do a similar thing for every article. We've built a label that tells you the number of peer reviewers that were involved. It tells you about the number of days to publication. That gives you a link to the editorial board and the editors who have ORCID, so you can see their profiles. Past reviewers, whether there's a conflict of interest statement associated with this article, whether there's data availability, and who funded it in terms of the research. So in this publication facts label is clearly, I've just borrowed this concept from the field of nutrition. I've applied it to research, but we think it's a way of leveling the playing field. We think it's a way of overcoming apprehensions about new journals. We think it's a way of encouraging the journals to adhere to scholarly standards. The editors and the publishers don't add any of this data, don't enter the data. The data is taken directly from the publishing platform. Now, it's not hack proof. You could, with some skill and coding ability, break into it, but it's raised the bar. And it shows that the journal is adhering to those standards at multiple levels, which would be quite complicated to fake. And it provides, as it were, a basis of trust, but trust for the public and for researchers, and particularly the early career researchers, because we need to recognize that open access, the universality of open access means public access. We're testing the label. In fact, this week we're testing the label in high schools in Pennsylvania. And we've tested them before in California. So we want this idea that part of a science education, part of an informed public, will be to see that open access is a source of reliable information in what is, alas, an age of misinformation. And this is part of the universality and part of the sustainability. The sustainability aspect is that if people trust research, and there has been a loss of trust in science, if people trust research, if people see it's a valuable contribution, then it sustains the support for that research from governments, from institutions, and others. So this aspect, in terms of what we've tried to do over the last 26 years or so, this aspect of how do we create sustainable and universal open access is by no means done, has had more or less success in a number of efforts. But I want you to take this idea forward. I want you to repeat it to yourself silently as you're walking through the trees or wherever it is you're listening to this talk, that the aspect of sustainable and universal open access needs to be our mantra going forward. Okay? And that it needs to be the measure that we apply to new initiatives, to goals that we set for ourselves. And it needs to be an expectation. This is what we expect, and this is what we deserve. Thank you very much.